Hey there, everybody. Today we're going to be going over an updated deck profile for MirageGaogamon. This is a deck that I was able to pilot at this weekend's in-person regionals at GenCon in Indianapolis. Had a blast, had a really fun time playing this deck, and was able to get top 32 with this list. I did go over a list previously of MirageGaogamon with my initial build that I have made changes to prior to GenCon. And I do think those changes really helped me out a whole lot and really made this deck perform, to the degree that it did. I played a ton of different decks, including Alphamon, ShineGreymon, Royal Knights, Wargreymon, Beelzemon, and I think this deck performed really, really well and really kept toe-to-toe with a lot of the big hitters in this meta. So I just wanted to share with you my deck profile. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what feedback you have for the deck. And without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so eggs, we're running 4 of the starter deck Demi-Vemon. You really want your DP boost from this egg. Getting 1k DP if you have 8 or more cards in hand is just something that's very helpful, particularly in this meta, whether it's with DP reduction or swinging into stacks where, there's burst modes in security, or there's Royal Knights that you're playing against that they're going to be a lot of boss monsters with high DP in there. You really want as big of a stack as possible going into your swing. So that's why I'm running Demi-Vemon. Level 3s, we are running 4 of the BT11 Gaomon. BT11 Gaomon's great in the sense that it's sort of your staple searcher for the deck. You look at your top 3. You're able to pick up a Digimon with Gaogamon in name and a blue tamer, which is the majority of your deck. So it's a great early game search. You got to throw that body out there, get your pieces, because that's what you really want to do with this deck is get your pieces, build your stack as fast as possible, and then when the time is right, you go for game. Its inheritable's not bad. If you have a tamer in play and you're swinging, you can bounce a level 3, so you could potentially be taking out some of those pesky memory blockers like Agazi, for example. But I think most of the time, if I were to use this card, I'm using it as my searcher. Next level 3 we're running are 3 of BT11 Vemon. This card, again, is another searcher, but it's a more specific, more nuanced searcher in the sense that you're not picking up any of your Gaogamon pieces. You're really only picking up your tamers with this card. So you do have to be careful about when and how you're playing this card, because you don't want to search and then bottom deck, say, a top end that you need or missing level 4 or level 3. So you really want to be sort of nuanced with how you play this search. I do think its inheritable is actually quite good for this deck. When you play a blue tamer, you gain a memory. So I think for me, the inheritable came up a lot more times than I anticipated. So if I were to have this in the stack and just go up my line with this as my level 3 inheritable, it actually wasn't bad, because late game, if I'm playing a Thomas or I need to play a Thomas to restand, this makes that a lot more efficient, and I think that can be underlooked and a very underrated inheritable. So I really liked Vemon in this list. And then lastly, rounding out our rookies with 4 of the EX4 Gaomon. I think your best rookie for this deck still. On play, it's sort of like a pseudo-Thomas, BT13 Thomas, where both players draw a card. And then the inheritable to gain a memory every time your opponent adds a card via effect is great too. It's just so good for what this deck wants to do, and it synergizes with the core values of this deck. So I really liked it. I'd say, you run it out of 4 of, and that rounds out your rookies. Moving on to our level 4s, we've got 1 Beelzemon from BT11. I swapped this guy out in place of my previous BT11 Gaogamon, mainly just because of the inheritable effect. It is the exact same inheritable as Vemon, where if you play a blue tamer, you gain a memory, which, again, can really make your late game plays a little bit more memory efficient if you're kind of lacking for it. So that's why I ran it out of 1 of. I don't think you want to be digivolving it for the draw effect most of the time. You're really just going into it for that memory gain. The next level 4 we're playing is BT13 Galgamon. When digivolving, you get to play a Thomas if you don't have one for free, which again is great for your board setup. A play that you can do is, play out your Searcher, and then if you are able to pick a Thomas from it, then next turn, if that Searcher is still there, just digivolve for 2, play out a Thomas, and there you go. You've had a very efficient way to set up your board. So I think it's very good. Its inheritable is not bad either. When your opponent has 8 or more cards in hand, all turns, this Digimon gets plus 1k DP, which again, in a DP reduction meta and a big DP meta, this card is not bad. So definitely a 4 of, I think. And last, level 4 is 4 of EX4 Galgamon. When digivolving, you can return a level 3 to hand. This didn't really come up for me as much. Sometimes if I was really desperate to get that small body off the board, sure, I would go into EX4 Galgamon. But more often than not, I'm digivolving this in the back. The inheritable to gain a memory when an opponent adds cards to hand via effect, again, is still just very good. And if you can imagine, if you're piling up memory by bouncing, you're making your plays just that much more efficient. So I really like this card too. But again, really just keeping it in the back as a stack as opposed to having it out on the field. In terms of our level 5s, we ran 3 of the BT11 Mock Galgamon. When digivolving, it gains blocker for the turn, and then you gain plus 2k DP for every 4 cards in your opponent's hand, which is not a bad effect. It does give you a blocker stack and a big one at that at most times. Inheritable, also not bad. When an effect adds a card to your opponent's hand, you can unsuspend this Digimon. It's an all turns effect as well. Again, not a bad card to have on board, but I almost would rather have EX4 Mock Galgamon instead. So I think thinking about my ratios, I'd almost flip these two, or at least run 4 of my EX4 Mock Galgamon. Just because this card, I just felt like the inheritable was a lot easier to achieve. The inheritable of this is when attacking, if your opponent has 8 or more cards in hand, you unsuspend this Digimon. So that I just feel like is a lot easier to fulfill and gives you that extra restand that you need. The one digivolving effect is not bad either. You're able to bounce a level 4 back to hand, which could be helpful in certain scenarios, but the inheritable I just felt like was so much more achievable for EX4 Mock Galgamon than BT11 Mock Galgamon. So I think if I were to make a change moving forward, I would probably bump this EX4 Mock Galgamon up to at least a 3, if not a 4 of, and take out my BT11 Mock Galgamons, either reducing it to 2 or even 1. Next level 5 we're running, which honestly was one of my, if not the MVP of the deck, was starter deck Wargreymon. So this card has jamming inherently, and then its inheritable is during your turn, if you have 8 or more cards in hand, you gain security check +1. So key thing is that, you have 8 or more. Not your opponent, but you, which for me was extremely easy to fulfill. You're drawing so much with this deck, you're cycling so much with this deck, you are definitely going to have 8 or more in hand. So you are more often than not giving your boss monster +1 security check, which really I think gave this deck the gas and the tempo it needed to keep up with a lot of the sort of bigger players in like ShineGreymon, Alphamon, whatnot, where sometimes I think Mirage was lacking in terms of aggression. This deck just gave it the turbo, I think, that it needed to be that next level. So a combo play I'll go over in a little bit is swing with jamming and then be able to restand, go into your boss monster, and now Mirage Burst Mode has check +1 every time they swing, which is not a bad way to go, and also really helps you close out your games very, very quickly. So I ran this at 3. I almost would consider running this guy at a 4 of, and doing like a 4/4 of EX4 Mock Galgamon and 4 of the starter deck Arrow V. But I'll keep testing with it and see where we end up. In terms of level 6s, we are playing 2 BT13 MirageGaogamon. I think more of a nuanced level 6. It's not the one I want to go into, but I do see scenarios where it can be very helpful. When Digivolving, you're able to bounce one of your opponent's tamers back to their hand, which, if you're playing against decks like ShineGreymon or Hunters, that can really slow them down and mess up their sequencing. All turns, if an opponent adds a card to their hand, you get to play out a Thomas, which, again, can be helpful in setting your board up. So I think this card has its uses. Again, it's not something I want to see a lot of, but at the same time, in the right scenario, can be very, very helpful. It also has Evade, which can help you survive like just straight up deletion effects, such as like Oryukin, or for example, if you're getting like popped just straight up by deletion, you can evade. It doesn't evade DP reduction though, so be careful with that. But I think this card is pretty good as sort of a tech level 6 depending on the scenario. The key MVP level 6 though is this guy right here, BT11 MirageGaogamon. This card is just so good. When Digivolving, you can return a level 5 or below back to hand, or your opponent's hand. If you're not able to do that, meaning that they just don't have a board, or they have a level 6 or higher in play, you bounce the top card of their security to hand. So you will always bounce something back to hand, proccing off a lot of your effects, and then all turns, when something is added to your opponent's hand, you gain 1 memory for every 4 in hand. So again, this card is a 4 cost to Digivolve, but at times you're Digivolving into it for maybe 2, 1, sometimes free depending on your inheritables. It's just very good. It's a very, very good tempo card, but also a good control card, because the amount of times I was able to regain my turn or steal turn again because opponents forgot about this all turns effect was huge. The amount of times that an opponent would either say search for a card, add to hand, play a boost, add to hand, or even like Alphamon, right? If they have a Yuji and they push their stack up and this guy's live, they've added cards to hand by effect. I will gain memory, right? And that sometimes can really mess up their plays. So having this guy out on board just as like a floodgate is also just extremely helpful and extremely frustrating to play against. So I really enjoyed having this card on field. He's just so good for what this deck wants to do. And then we're playing 3 to round out our Digimon. 3 Mirage Burst Mode. When Digivolving, you return one of your opponent's Digimon back to hand. And then similar to what BT11 Mirage would do, you gain 1 memory for every 4 cards in their stack. So another way to just be very memory efficient. It's a free burst evo. Sometimes if you want to just be threatening, you just hard Digivolve for 5 and pass turn, because you'll gain the memory back and you went into this guy for like potentially 3 or whatnot. So a very good boss monster. When attacking, if your opponent has 9 or more in hand, you can choose to bottom deck so that their hand size is down to 8, and you choose at random. So you choose at random whatever cards are in their hand until they get to 8 cards in hand, and then you restand him. And then you can swing and do that effect again if you're able to get them back up to 9, for example. So your unsuspend loop can be infinite depending on what you're able to proc effect-wise with this card. So very, very good card. At first, I was afraid of running that only at 3 because I was afraid of not seeing it. But I think with the amount of draw and the amount of cycle you have with this deck, 3 is more than enough and plenty to be able to see it. So I wouldn't run it at like 4. I think 3 is a good sweet spot. Tamer-wise, we're running 3 of the new BT13 Thomas. It is a memory setter, which can be helpful for just making sure you have enough resources. And then during your turn, if one of your cards with Gaomon or Gaogamon swing, you can suspend this Tamer to have both players draw a card. So sort of going off of Mirage, right? If you got them to 8 and you swing with Mirage, well, you can just go ahead and tap Thomas when you swing again. to get them back up to 9. And then you can proc Mirage's effect again to bottom deck to get to 8 and then swing. So it's a way to just keep your unsuspend loop going with this card. You do want to be careful, because if you are not going for lethal and you suspend Thomas to have both of you draw, sometimes you can help your opponent unbrick, right? Because now you are giving them draw power as well. So you really want to be careful with when and how you proc this guy's effect off. But I think if you're going with your combo plays, like this guy is huge for keeping this going. But I think what's even bigger was BT4 Thomas. I really enjoyed this card a lot more, honestly, than the BT13 counterpart. This guy was an on-play draw card. So it's a 3 cost to play. On play, you draw a card, which helps you just keep cycling your pieces. And then during the main phase, if your opponent has 8 or more in hand, you can suspend Thomas to restand one of your Digimon with Gao name. So if you can imagine, decks like Belphamon, decks like Royal Knights sometimes, it's hard to get them to 8, let alone more than 8, right? So if you're able to just finagle it so that they're at 8, you can swing and just keep suspending your Thomases to restand your Digimon. So sometimes if you were having like multiple of these guys on board, you can do so much damage without having to rely on that extra draw or that extra card to get into their hand to be able to proc like burst mode effect. You can just straight up do it with this guy. So I really liked seeing this guy at 4 because more often than not, I'd be able to play him, cycle through, help set up board, but also just look for my pieces. And then during the late game when I'm really making that final push, this guy really helped me out a lot. So those are our tamers. In terms of our options, we ran 4 memory boost. Just because of the way I was playing this deck and sort of the mindset I went into it, I think patience was key, and making sure that I found my pieces and then pushing out at the right time was when I did really well. So at that point, I think you have to run 4 memory boosts just to ensure that you're hitting your pieces consistently and also giving yourself resources late game to prolong that combo play and make sure that combo play is sometimes the final play. So blue memory boost, I think at a 4 of is sort of, you have to do it in order to make sure you're not bricking. And then last option is Sorai. We ran it at a 2 of. Really important card for matchups like Royal Knights and ShineGreymon. Royal Knights, you sort of force them to say, look, you can play your guys out, but they won't be able to swing. Or if you have to be able to anticipate that omni play and being like, okay, I need to slow them down another turn. Here's a Sorai, right? Same thing with Marcus and ShineGrey. If you see that they have everything set up for that sort of promote Marcus, swing, go into your big guy, swing again, do all the burst mode shenanigans, you have to be able to see that and envision that and be like, okay, well, if you're going to do that next turn, here's a Sorai. You can't do that anymore, So I think it does take a little bit of board recognition and a little bit of anticipation in order to use this card effectively. But I think in this meta in particular, a must. You have to be running at least 2 of if you're playing blue, I think. If you can fit more in, great. But I think the deck is tight enough where 2, I think, is the happy spot for me. And that rounds out the deck. If you can see, I'm not running Ice Wall. I'm not running, things like Hammer Spark or anything like that. Simply because, like I said, this deck is just so tight that sometimes you just don't have the room for the cards that you may just not see. You really want to optimize the combo plays and the cards you want to see more than sort of these 1 or 2 tech ofs, in my opinion. I'm not going to claim to be the MirageGaogamon expert over here, but this is just the deck that worked for me. A combo play that I really enjoyed was, ideally you have some Thomases set up. So for example, I think 1 of each is ideal. If you have another one, that's fine. But I think having one Memory Setter Thomas is ideal, and then one Thomas from BT4, and then your stack, say, looks like this, where you have Aerovedramon on top, you have EX4 Gaogamon and EX4 Gaomon as your inheritable. At this point, I would promote, right? As you promote, just go ahead and swing with Aerov, because you have jamming. If you haven't checked security yet, say this is your first check, you check with jamming and you live, right? Great. You're at 3 memory. You can then go into BT11 MirageGaogamon, which will bounce something back to hand. Say they have a level 5, right? You bounce that back to hand. You gain 2 memory off of your 2 level 3 and level 4 inheritables, and you'll gain memory off of Mirage. So more often than not, you're going into this guy, for example, say for a 1 cost, right? So now you're at 2 memory. If your opponent has 8 cards in hand, tap Thomas to restand, okay? Now this guy is live. So you can make a decision here to say, okay, do I swing 2 checks at 13k because you're Demi V, or do I wait, right? I think if you're playing decks like Hunters, you're playing decks like, for example, Blue Flare, I think you're safe swinging with this guy, because more often than not, you'll be surviving because most of their Digimon are quite low. If you're playing against like Royal Knights or Wargreymon or even the mirror match, you do want to be a little bit careful, because the chance that you swing into something higher is there. So depending on the matchup, you would swing, but I'd say you don't swing, right? Say you just say, look, we're going to be safe. We'll go into burst mode. Burst mode, you go for free by returning a Thomas. In this turn, you return this BT4 Thomas. So you're live. You're able to swing. This point, you proc your BT13 Thomas to have you both draw. If now they have 9, you're able to proc burst mode to bottom deck 1, restand. You swung for 2, you survive. So they're down to 2 security. You can swing burst mode again. You can then tap Thomas, because now, assuming they have 8, and swing for game, right? You've done effectively 4 checks with this guy. You did 1 check with Aerov, and then the last check you swing. If you're needing that extra swing, you can go ahead and play Thomas again, restand, swing again, right? That's how powerful this deck can be, and that is your OTK play, right? You don't leave them room to respond. You just want to end it right there. When you're promoting into Mirage and going into burst mode, your mindset should be, I'm going for game and I'm going for lethal. If anything, sometimes you can go into burst mode to, like, say, clear a big body, right? If they've left something suspended or whatnot and you really want that board control, sure, you can go into Mirage, bounce something, go into burst mode again, bounce something, and swing over a big body, sure. But you want to ensure that you have the stack alive for next turn, because if they have a way to blow up your stack, you're in a sticky situation, because now you got to set everything back up again, which can just be enough tempo loss to just lose the game. So that's why I usually will say, if you're going into burst mode and you're raising your stack, you really want to be able to make sure you're going for game. And this setup right there did it, right? Like 5 checks were gone. Potentially going for 6, 7 checks with this deck. So I think it's just such a fun deck to play. I do think, like I said, you have to be patient and go for that OTK play. But when you're able to do it, man, it's nasty. It's real nasty. So that's the deck that I piloted. That's how I piloted it to get to top 32. So let me know what you guys think. The deck profile photo should have been on in the earlier part of the video, so if you're looking for that, that's your reference. If you have any comments, feedback for the deck, do let me know, and hope you guys enjoyed. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.